Good morning, everybody. My name is Myra Kornbluth, and I'm going to read an excerpt from the series of Rumpole of the Bailey, written by John Mortimer. He's a playwright, a novelist, and a former practicing barrister. During the war, he worked with the Crown Film Unit and published a number of novels before turning to the theater. He's written many film scripts, radio, and television plays, including 6 plays on the life of Shakespeare, the Rumpole plays, which won him the British Academy Winner of the Year award. And this is from the, as I say, the series of Rumpole of the Bailey. There also was, years ago, a series that had Rumpole of the Bailey. He's a wonderful officer of the law, with quite a funny sense of humor. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from the series. This one is called Rumpole and the Female, the Species. It may be said by those who read these memoirs, particularly by those of the female persuasion, that Rumpole is in some ways unsympathetic to the aspirations of women. This may be because in the privacy of my own thoughts, and when writing late at night in the solitary confines of my kitchen, I refer to my wife Hilda Rumpole as she who must be obeyed. It's true that I have given her this title, but Hilda's character, her air of easy command, which might, if she had been born in other circumstances, have brought empires under her sway, and her undisputed government of our daily life at Foxbury Court entitles her to no less an acclamation. Those who feel that I am not firmly on the female side in the battle of the sexes may care to consider my long struggle to get Miss Fiona Always accepted as a member of our chambers at Equity Court. And those who might think that I only engaged myself in this struggle to annoy the egregious Bollard and irritate Claude Erskine Brown, are guilty of a quite unworthy cynicism. The dispute over the entry of Miss Always into our close-knit group of learned friends arose during the time that our chambers had a brief in the Pond Hill Bank job. We were charged with the defense of Tony Timpson. I have written repeatedly elsewhere of the large family of South London villains who many years ago appointed me their Attorney General, and whose unending efforts have brought a considerable amount of work to Equity Court. Tony Timpson belonged to the younger generation of the clan. He had occupied a pleasant semi-detached post on a South London estate with his wife April and their child Vincent. His house was lavishly furnished with a large variety of video recording machines, television sets, hi-fi equipment, spin dryers, eyeline grills, ultraviolet ray cookers, deep freezes, and such like aids in gracious living. Many of these articles were said to be the fruit of Tony Timpson's tireless night work. When Inspector Broom called at the Timpson house shortly after the Pond Hill Bank job, he found the young master alone and playing Home Sweet Home on a newly acquired electric organ. He also found £5,000 in crisp, new, neatly packaged 20-pound notes in the gleaming Super Snow White Extra Deluxe model washing machine. Tony Timpson was ripped from the bosom of his wife April and young Vincent and placed within the confines of Brixton Prison. And I wonder if I should ultimately get the brief. The appointment of Rumpole for the defense should, of course, have been a foregone conclusion. But the Timpson Solicitor General was Mr. Bernard, and between that gentleman and Rumpole, there was a bit of a cold wind blowing, owing to a tiff which had taken place one day at the Uxbridge Magistrates' Court. I had arrived at this particular Palais de Justice a little late one day, owing to a tailback on the Piccadilly line. only to discover that the gutless Bernard had allowed our client of the day to plead guilty to a charge of handling. He had thrown in the towel. I hadn't actually been rude to Mr. Bernard. I had merely improved his education by quoting Shakespeare's Richard II. "Oh, villain, viper, damned without redemption," I said to my instructing solicitor. "Would you make peace? Terrible hell make war upon your spotted soul for this." Mr. Bernard, it seemed, hadn't appreciated the quality of the lines, and there was, as I say, an east wind blowing between us. So I wasn't greatly surprised when Henry gave me an account of what happened. Bernard came into our clerk's room and gave Henry the brief in R versus Timpson. Henry said that he supposed that would be for Mr. Rumpole. "I was wrong, young man," Mr. Bernard said firmly. "Do I?" Henry raised his eyebrows. "The brief is clearly marked for the attention of Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown." Bernard pointed out, and Henry saw that it was so. "I can put up with a good deal, Henry, members of the so-called senior branch of our great profession," Mr. Bernard told him. "But I will not be called a villainous viper in the clear hearing of the clerk to the Uxbridge Magistrates' Court." At which point Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown, now an extremely successful lady barrister, entered the clerk's room, and Henry handed her the papers. "A wonderfully prepared brief, I don't doubt, like all Mr. Bernard's work," Phillida smiled, great charm, at the glowing solicitor, and then asked tactfully, "How's your daughter, Mr. Bernard? Polytechnic going well, still, is it?" Mrs. Erskine Brown, since the days when she was plain Miss Phillida Trout, hadn't got where she was by legal ability alone. She was expert in public relations. "3 A's, Mr. Bernard was delighted to say. "Thank you for asking." "And still keeping up her figure skating, I bet." "Off the old block. What did you say, Henry?" "See you in Brixton, Mr. Bernard." Flashed another smile and went on her way. Whereupon Bernard told Henry that he always thought that Mrs. Erskine Brown had a real feeling for the law. I had decided to improve the facilities on our mansion flat at Froxbury Court by erecting a shelf in our living room wall to accommodate such necessities as the Oxford Book of English Verse, Professor Andrew Ackerman on the importance of bloodstains in the detection of crime, Art Bowles' Criminal Pleading and Practice, a little out of date, and a spare bottle or two of Chateau Thames Embankment of a fairly recent year. I celebrated my entry into the construction industry by buying what I think is known as a kit of easy-do convenience shelving and a few basic tools, and in no time at all, such was my natural feeling for woodwork, I had the shelf up, triumphantly bearing its load. When I showed the results of my labors to Hilda, she didn't immediately congratulate me, but asked unnecessarily, I thought, if I had plugged the wall in accordance with the instructions that came in the easy-do box. "I never read the instructions to counsel before doing murder, Hilda," I told her. "Rely on the facts and the instinct of the advocate. It's never let me down yet in the court." "Well, I do notice you haven't been in court very much lately," Hilda took an unfair advantage. "Temporary lull in business. Nothing serious," I assured her. "It's because you're rude to solicitors." Hilda, of course, knew better. I didn't want to argue the matter further, so I told her that my new shelf was firm as a rock and added an air of distinction in our living room. "Are you sure it's straight?" Hilda asked. "I think it's definitely at an angle." "Oh, really, Hilda, because you're at an angle," I said, I'm afraid a little impatiently. "One small gin and tonic at lunchtime, and you do your well-known imitation of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Well, if that's how you talk to solicitors, Hilda was starting to tidy away my carpenter's tools, sweep up the sawdust. No wonder I've got you home all day. As I remarked earlier, there's a good deal to be said in favor of she who must be obeyed, but she's hardly a fair opponent in an argument. I left our improved home and went down to Chambers, and there being not much else to engage my attention before a 5 o'clock Chambers meeting, I took a little time off to instruct Miss Fiona Always, who had proudly acquired a case entirely of her own, in the art of making a final speech for the defense. Picture us then, alone in my room, teacher Rumpole standing as though to address the court, the pupil Always sitting obediently to learn. Soon this case will be over, members of the jury. I gave her my usual peroration. In a little while, you will go back to your jobs and your family, and you will forget all about it. At most, is it only a small part of your lives? My client is the whole of his life. And it is that life I leave with confidence in your hands, certain that there can be only one verdict in this case, not guilty. Sink down, exhausted then, Fiona. Mopping the brow, I sat and applied a large red spotted handkerchief. Good end to a final speech, don't you think? Will it work just as well for me? She asked doubtfully. I mean, my man's only accused of making 6 frozen chicken pieces from Safeways. Just as well on any occasion, I assured her. And then Lord Erskine Brown put his head round the door and told me that Ballard was upstairs and just about to start the Chambers meeting. Erskine Brown then retired, and Fiona looked at me in a despondent sort of manner. Is this when they decide? She sounded desperately anxious. If they're going to let me stay on here? Don't worry, I shall tell them, I promised her. What? Well, let me think, something like, the female of the species is more deadly than the male. Look on the bright side, Miss Always. Perk up, Fiona. I've cracked far tougher chords than that light up there. I went to the door without any real idea of how to handle the case of Always. And then, as so often happens, thank God, inspiration struck. I turned back towards her. Oh, by the way, I said, just one question. You know old Claude, who just popped his head in here? Mr. Erskine Brown? He doesn't tickle your fancy, does he, by any chance? You don't find him devastatingly attractive? Of course not, Fiona managed her first deep smile of the day. He's hardly Paul Newman, is he? No, I suppose he isn't. I must confess the news came as me as something of relief. Well, that's all right then. I'll see what I can do. Ballard had made a few changes, none of them very much for the better, in Featherstone's old room. Guthrie's comfortable, others had gone, and his silver cigarette box, his picture of Marigold and the children, his comforting sherry decanter, and bone china tea service, and his perfectly harmless watercolors. Ballard had few luxuries except the number of etchings of English cathedrals in plain light oak frames, the corners of which protruded in a Gothic and ecclesiastical manner, and an old tin of ginger biscuits which stood on his desk and which he never offered about. Sorry, am I late for evensong? I asked cheerfully as I sat beside Uncle Tom. Ballard, without a glance in my direction, continued with the business at hand. We have to consider an application by Fiona Always for a permanent seat in Chambers, he said. Mrs. Erskine Brown, you were her pupil, master. Mistress, I corrected him. Nobody noticed. It's an extremely tough life at the bar for a woman. Relative spoke from the depths of her experience. I'm by no means sure that Always has got what it takes. Just as a for instance, She burst into tears when left alone at Thames Magistrates' Court. I know exactly how she felt, I said. That was never my favorite tribunal. Of course, Rumpel's done a case with her. Ballard looked at me in a vaguely accusing manner. She took a note from me once. Something about her I liked. I had to admit. And when Hoskins asked me what it was, I said that she felt strongly about winning cases. Who is this fellow always? Uncle Tom asked with an expression of mild bewilderment. This fellow's a girl, Uncle Tom, I told him. Oh, good heavens. Are we getting another one of them? Our oldest inhabitant grumbled, and Mrs. Erskine Brown brought the discussion up to date by saying, I really don't think that the mere fact that this girl is a girl should guarantee her place at 3 Equity Court. Billy's perfectly right. Claude came in as a dutiful husband should. We shouldn't take it in a token woman like a token black. Are we taking in a black woman then? Uncle Tom merely asked for clarity. Why not? I said. I could have brought one back from Africa. This is obviously a problem and has to be taken seriously. Ballard spoke disapprovingly from the chair. Well, I think we should go for a well-established man. Someone who's got to know a few solicitors and work in chambers. Mrs. Erskine Brown suggested politically. Steady on, Portia, old fellow, I cautioned her. Whatever happened to the quality of mercy? I honestly don't see what mercy has to do with it. Dear God, I was moved to say, it seems but yesterday that Miss Villa Tom, white in the wig and a newcomer into the ladies' robing room, was accusing Henry of hiding the key to the lavatory as a sexist gesture. Can it be that now you've stormed the citadel and you want to slam the door behind you? Really, Rumpole, Ballard called me to order. You're not addressing a jury now. I don't think anyone could possibly accuse this chamber of having the slightest prejudice against female barristers. Of course not, provided they settle somewhere else. No doubt we find them quite delightful. I agreed. I believe I've told you all that I've applied for a silk gown. Erskine Brown was never tired of telling us this. I'm sure you look extremely pretty in it, I assured him. And from what I hear, quite informally, of course, in the bag, is it, Erskine Brown? That's not for me to say. The filly is, of course, right behind me in this. Absolutely, his wife assured him. Erskine Browns were in a conjugal mood that day. And he rambled on saying, so with the 2 QCs at the top, it would be a great pity if these chambers became weak in the tail. What would be a pity? Uncle Tom asked me. If our tail got weak, Uncle Tom. Of course it would. It was a puzzling meeting for the old boy. Erskine Brown didn't further enlighten him by saying, I'm not interested in the sex side, of course. I noticed then that his wife was looking into the middle distance in a detached sort of way. But I just don't feel that always is the right person to carry on the best tradition of these chambers. I agree, Hoskins. So Fiona always can swell the ranks of the unemployed? I asked with some asperity. Oh, come on, Rumple. She's got a rich daddy. She's not going to starve. Only miss the one thing she's ever wanted to do, I grumbled. But Ballard was collecting the final views of the meeting. He asked Uncle Tom for considered opinion. I remember Fiona. Used to work in the list office. Uncle Tom wasn't particularly helpful. She wasn't black, of course. No, I'm against it. Well, I think I've got the sense of the meeting. I shall tell Miss Always that she'll have to look elsewhere. It was time for quick thinking, and I thought extremely quickly. The best way to confuse lawyers is to tell them about a law they think they've forgotten. Just a moment. I hauled a diary out of my waistcoat pocket. What is it, Rumpole? Ballard sounded impatient. This isn't the third Thursday of the Hillary term, I said severely. Of course it isn't. Erskine Brown had not got my point, but I had just in time. Well, I said positively, we always decide questions of Chambers entry on the third Thursday of the Hillary team. It was a rule of my sainted father-in-law's day. Guthrie Featherstone observed it religiously. Of course, if the new broom wants to make any radical changes. I looked at Ballard in a strict sort of way. I must say, he flinched. Well, no, he said, I suppose not. Are you sure it's the rule? He looked at Erskine Brown, who couldn't say he remembered it. We're in rompers, Erskine Brown, when this thing was first decided, I told him impatiently. Our old clerk, Albert, said it was impossible otherwise from a bookkeeping point of view. I do think that we should keep to the rules, don't you, Bollard? I mean, we can't have anarchy at Equity Court. That's in 4 weeks' time. Ballard was consulting his diary now. Exactly. Ballard put away his diary and came to a decision. He'll deal with it then. It shouldn't take long, as we've reached a conclusion. Oh no, a mere formality. I agreed. What are you playing at, Rumpole? Mrs. Erskine Brown was looking at me. Some suspicion. Nothing much, Portia, I assured her. Merely keeping up the best traditions of these chambers. The Pond Hill branch of the United Metropolitan Bank was held up by a number of men in stocking masks who carried pole nails from which emerged a sawn-off shotgun or two and a sledgehammer for shattering the glass in front of the cashier. When the robbery was complete, the four masked men ran to the getaway car, a stolen Ford Cortina, which was waiting for them outside the bank. And it was this vehicle, the prosecution alleged, that Tony Timpson had been driving. On the way to the car, one of the men stumbled and fell. He was seized upon by an officer on traffic duty and later found to be a Mr. Jerry Malloy, a remarkable fact when you consider the deep hostility which has always existed between the Timpson family and the clan Malloy. Indeed, these two tribes have hated each other for as long as I can remember, and I have already chronicled an instance of their feud. It seems that all the other men engaged on the Pond Hill enterprise were Malloys. They got away, so it was hardly to be wondered that Mr. Gerald Malloy decided to become a grass involved a Timpson when he told his story to the police. In the course of time, Mrs. Erskine Brown and her instructing solicitor went to Brixton to see their client. But as I later heard from him and Mr. Bernard, Tony Timpson seemed to have only one thing on his mind as he walked into the interview and said, "Where's Mr. Rumpole?" Phillida Erskine Brown, in her jolliest, "We're all lads together" voice, merely said, "Care for a fact, Tony?" Tony didn't mind if he did, and when Phillida had lit it for him, Bernard broke the bad news. "This is Mrs. Erskine Brown, Tony," he said. "She's going to be your brief. See, they've charged you with taking part in the robbery, not merely the receiving." "Of course, they've done that on Jerry Malloy's evidence," Phillida started in a beautiful way. But Tony Timpson was looking at his solicitor in a kind of panic, paying no attention to her at all. "Mr. Rumpole, always the Timpson's brief," he said. "You know that, Mr. Bernard." Mr. Rumpole defended my dad and my Uncle Cyril and saw me through my juvenile court, my Borstal training. "Mr. Rumpole can't have done all that well for you if he got Borstal training," Bernard said reasonably. "Well," Tony looked at Phillida for support. "Win or lose, win a few, lose a few. You know, that, Mrs. Any reason why Jerry Malloy should grass on you, Tony?" Phillida tried to return to the matter at hand. "Look, good of you to come here, but at which Phillida, no doubt in an attempt to reassure a client, lapsed into Robert's aura. You ever had a meeting with him where any sort of bank job was ever mentioned? She asked. Malloy says in the depths that he was the sledge. Two others had sawn-offs in the roadhill, and you were the driver. He says you're pretty good on wheels, Tony. This is highly embarrassing. Tony looked suitably pained at Phillida's personal knowledge of crime. What is, Tony? She did her best to sound deeply sympathetic. You, being a woman and all, it don't feel right. Not for a woman. Don't think of me as a woman. Try to reassure her. Think of me entirely as a brief. No good, Tony shook his head. I keep thinking of my wife, April. Of course, she's worried about you. That's only natural, seeing you got nicked, Tony. I don't mean that. I mean, I wouldn't want a woman like my April to take on my job, would I? Briefs? And that's what gets ourselves into a bit of trouble down the hill in that? It's all man's work, isn't it? Well, that may come as a huge shock to all readers of those women pages, which I have occasionally glanced at in Fiona Always Guardian. But I'm told that it is exactly what Tony Timpson said. As a consequence, it was a rueful Phillida Erskine Brown who walked away from the interview room across the yard where the screws exercised the Alsatians and the trustees weeded the flower birds toward the gate. Timpsons are such old-fashioned villains, Mr. Bernard apologized. They're always about half a century behind the times. It's not your fault, Mr. Bernard, said Phillida miserably. You wait till my wife gets to hear this. They're pretty hot on women's rights in the Hammersmith SDP. Bernard was clearly deeply affronted. The client's right to choose. Phillida was taking it on the chin. It's decent of you to be like about this, Mr. Brown. It's absolutely no reflection on you, of course. But Bernard looked deeply embarrassed. I'm afraid I'll have to take in a chap to lead you. They had arrived at the gatehouse and were about to be sprung, and Phillida Erskine Brown looked at Mr. Bernard and said she wondered who the chap would be exactly. Goes against the grain, said Bernard, but we've really got no choice, have we? A good deal later that evening, I was on my way home when I happened to pass Pomeroy's wine bar, and in the hope that they might be offloading cooking claret at a reasonable rate, I went in and saw, alone and barely loitering at the bar with an oldish sandwich and a glass of hock, none other than Claude Erskine Brown. I saw the chance of playing another card in the long game of getting Fiona in the chamber, and I engaged the woebegone figure in conversation, the burden of which was that Phillida was so enormously busy at the bar that the sandwich might well have to do for the Erskine Brown supper. Of course, I said sympathetically, your wife must be pretty hard-pressed now that she's taken the Timpsons off me. She doesn't get home in the evening until Tristan's gone to bed, Erskine Brown told me. And I looked at him and said, just as well. You think so? The man sounded slightly offended. Just as well, Fiona always isn't coming into chambers, I explained. You agree that we shouldn't take her? In all the circumstances, well, perhaps I'd better not say anything. What do you mean, Rumpole? Erskine Brown was puzzled. I might have raised all sorts of problems. I mean, I might have got too much for you to handle. What might have got too much for me to handle? It would create all sorts of difficulties in the spring and all that sort of thing. We don't want the delicate perfume of young Fiona floating around chambers, do we? I said as casually as possible. Well, I don't suppose I'd seen much of her. Oh, but you would, you know. Not as a silk. You've been thrown together. Chambers meetings, brushing past each other in the clerk's room. Before you knew who you were, you'd be popping out for tea and a couple of chalky biscuits. I looked as gravely concerned as I knew how. Terribly dangerous. Why on earth? He still hadn't quite gotten my drift. Well, you know exactly what these young lady barristers are. Impressionable, passionate even. and enormously impressed with the older legal hack, especially one teetering on the verge of Kneebridge's silk gown. You don't mean... I could see that now he had perked up considerably. And she seems to find you extremely personable, boy. I laid it on thick. You put her in distinct mind, so she has told me, of a film actor, Newman. Could that be the name? I asked innocently and drained my glass, at which moment Lord Erskine Brown took off his spectacles and admired himself in one of the mirrors, decorated with fronds of frosty vegetation that covered Pomeroy's walls. Ridiculous, he said, but I could see that the old fish was well and truly hooked. Of course it's ridiculous, I agreed. But on second thought, far better, she doesn't get into chambers. Wouldn't you agree? I left him then, but as I went out of Pomeroy's, Erskine Brown was still looking at himself short-sightedly in the mirror. The next day, Henry gave me the glad news that I was to be leading the extraordinarily busy Mrs. Phyllis Erskine Brown in the Timpson defense. It seemed that Mr. Bernard had seen sense on the subject of our little disagreement at Uxbridge, but Henry told me extremely severely that he couldn't go on clerking for me, and if I called my instructing solicitor a viper again, I asked him if he'd passed Snape, assured him I wasn't serious, and then went up to seek out our new head of chambers in his lair. I was going to play the next card in the Fiona Always game. I knocked at the door, heard a cry of "Whose is it?" and found Ballard with a cup of tea and a ginger biscuit working on some massive prosecution involving a large number of villains who were all represented by different colored pencils. "Oh, it's you." Our leader didn't sound particularly welcome. All the same, I came in, pushed Ballard's paper aside, and sat on the edge of his desk. "Just thought I ought to give you a friendly warning," I started confidentially. "Isn't it that needs warning? Henry told me that you'd taken it to becoming offensive to Mr. Bernard." I lit up a small cigar and blew out smoke. Ballard coughed pointedly. "It doesn't do my chambers any good, you know, insulting a solicitor," he told me. By way of an answer, I closed my eyes and tried a vivid description. "Fascinating character," I began. "Marvelous hair, burnished like autumn leaves, tender white neck sticking out of starched white collar." "Mr. Bernard?" Ballard was puzzled. "Of course not," I put him right. I was speaking of Miss Phillida Trent, now Mrs. Erskine Brown. I brought out the packet of small cigars and offered it. "You don't smoke, I suppose?" "You know I don't." "What do you do, I wonder?" There was a short diversion as Ballard drew my atch off his deposition, and then I said thoughtfully, "Gorgeous creature in many ways, our Portia." "The most enviable practice, I understand," Ballard agreed. "Perhaps she's polite to solicitors." "Determined to rise to the absolute top." "I have the highest respect for Phillida, of course, but devious," I supplied the word. "Brilliant mind, of course, but devious." "Rumpole, what are you trying to tell me?" Ballard seemed anxious to bring our dialogue to a swift conclusion. "The way she got you to show your sexual prejudices at that chambers meeting," I said with her. "My what?" "Your blind and Victorian opposition to women in the legal profession. I believe she's writing a report on that to the Bar Council, plus 10 articles for the Observer in depth. But Rumpole, she spoke always against all." Ballard was already arguing weakly. What a tactician. For the sake of emphasis, I gave Ballard a brisk slap on the shoulder. He seemed totally opposed to that girl. He slipped off his desk and took a turn around the room. "Just to lead you on, don't you see? To get you to show your hand. You walked right into it, Ballard. I can see the headlines now. Christian barrister presides over sexist redoubt. Ballard puts the clock back 50 years. Ballard, he corrected me without too much conviction, said, I didn't take that at him, surely. You will have done, I assured him. By the time our Phillida's finished with you, don't cross her, Ballard. I warn you. She has the ear of the Lord Chancellor. I don't know if you were ever hoping for some sort of minor judgeship. I went to the door and then turned back to Ballard. Of course, you have one thing in your favor. What's that? He seemed to prepare to clutch at a straw. Then that I played the ace. Our Portia seems to have taken something of a shine to you. I told him. Crackly handsome, I think is the way she put it. I suppose there's just a chance you might get around her. Try using your irresistible charm. I left him then. The poor old person, looking like he who has to choose between a public execution and a heady draft of hemlock. Whatever may be said about the equality of sexes, there's still something about the nature of women which parts the average man almost entirely from his marbles. Faced with most problems, both Erskine Brown and Ballard might have proved reasonably resolute. When the question concerned a moderately personable young woman, they became as clay in the potter's hands. These thoughts passed through my mind as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, while Hilda sat at the dressing table in night attire, brushing her hair before bed. What are you thinking, Rumpole? She asked. I know you, Rumpole. You're lying there thinking about something. I was thinking, I confessed, about man's attitude to the female of the species. Oh, were you indeed? Hilda sounded deeply suspicious. On the one hand, the presence of a woman strikes him with terror. Really, Rumpole, don't be absurd, Hilda said severely, in fierce resentment. Is that what you were thinking? And yet he finds her not only indispensable, but quite irresistible. Faced with a whiff of perfume, for instance, he's reduced to a state bordering on imbecility. Rumpole, are you really? Hilda's voice had softened considerably. The room became redolent with the smell of lavender water. Hilda was spraying on perfume. She is a woman, therefore may be wooed. She is a woman, therefore may be won. I repeated sleepily. I saw Hilda emerge from her dressing gown and make towards the bed. She said, oh, Rumpole, quite tenderly. But then sleep claimed me, and I heard no more. One afternoon, I turned up at the gates of Brixton Prison with my learned junior, Mrs. Phillips Erskine Brown. There was Mr. Bernard waiting for us and replying to my hearty greeting in a somewhat guarded manner. Hail to thee, Blythe, Bernard, I said, and he replied, we're taking you on the express wishes of the client, Mr. Rumpole, just for this case. I then became aware of a pleasant-looking young woman with blonde hair and a small, rather plump child who was sitting slumped in a pushchair, regarding me with a wary eye. Mr. Rumpole, the lady introduced herself. I'm April Timpson. Tony's that glad that you are going to be his brief. My companion looked less than flattered, but I greeted our client's family warmly. Mrs. Timpson, good of you to say so. And who's this young hopeful? That's our young Vince. Been in to see his dad, said the child's proud mother. Delighted to meet you, Vincent, I said, and managed to leave a thought with April, which might pay off in the course of time. Let me know, I said, the moment he gets into trouble. Straight up, it's a sodding plan, said Tony Timpson, and then turned apologetically to my junior. Pardon my French. Don't be so silly, Tony. Phillida did not like being taken for one of the boys. We were sitting in a small glass-walled room in the interview block at Brixton, and I felt I had to question Tony further as his suggested defense. What sort of plant are you suggesting, I asked. Floribunda of the Serious Crime Squad, or an exotic bloom cultivated by the Malloys? That D.I. Broom. He got no love for the Timpsons, Tony grumbled. Neither have the Malloys. That's true, Mr. Rumpole. That's very true. A plant by the Supergrasses family? Oh, it's possible. I consider the suggestion. I'd say it's typical. So some person unknown brought in the cash and popped it into the super Snow White extra deluxe easy wash and framed the charge. The jury may now wonder how Tony can afford all these luxuries out of window cleaning, Philadelphia suggested. It's not a luxury. My April says it's just something you got to have, said Tony, the proud house builder. You know how he affords these things, Portia? I explained one case to one not expert in the Timpson branch of the law. Tony's a minor villain. Small stuff. Let's have a look at his form. I plucked a sheet of paper from my brief. Warehouse breaking, shop breaking, criminal damage to a set of traffic lights. I misjudged a turning, Mr. Rumpole, Tony admitted. It was the item of which he seemed slightly ashamed, but there was more to come. Careless driving, dangerous driving, failure to report an accident, I read out. Look here, old sweetheart, if I get you out of this, do promise not to give me a lift home. That same evening, Claude Erskine Brown put his head round the door of my room, where Miss Fiona always was looking up a bit of law, and invited her to join him in a bottle of Pomeroy's bubbly. Naturally anxious to be on friendly terms with those who held her legal future in their hands, she accepted the invitation, and I'm indebted to her for an account of what then took place. Once ensconced at a corner table in the shadowy regions of the wine bar, Erskine Brown took off his spectacles and sighed as though worn out by the cares of all. It can be lonely at the top, Fiona, he said. I mean, you may wonder what it feels like to be on the verge, but perhaps he was waiting for her to say something. As she didn't he repeated with a sigh, I'll tell you, lonely. But you've got Mrs. Erskine Brown. Fiona was puzzled. Claude gave her a sad little smile. Mrs. Erskine Brown. I seem to see so little of Philida today. Pressures of work, of course. No, he went on seriously. There comes a time in this job when a person feels terribly alone. I suppose so. Fiona felt the top of his becoming exhausted. I envy you these happy, carefree days when you hop from magistrate's court to magistrate's court, picking up little crumbs of indecent exposure. Frozen chicken, Fiona corrected him. What? Erskine Brown looked puzzled. I was doing a case about frozen chicken pieces. Quite a responsibility to me. As the subject had moved from himself, Claude's attention wandered. He looked across to the bar and said, Is that old Rumpole over there? Why? Fiona asked in all innocence. Can't you see without your glasses? In fact, and this Erskine Brown didn't notice, perhaps because she was hidden in the melee at the bar, I had come into the joint with Philida in order that we may refresh ourselves after a hard conference at Brixton. I said I hoped she had no hard feelings about me being taken in to lead her in the Timpson affair. She confessed to just a few hard feelings, but was then sporting enough to buy us perfectly reasonable bottle. Criminals and barristers, Portia, I told her as Jack Pomeroy was uncorking the claret. Both extremely conservative professions. Before she had time to absorb this thought, Philida was off like a hound on the scent towards the corner of the room. Again, I have to rely on Miss Always' account for what was going on at that distant table. And if ever you have the slightest problem, Erskine Brown was saying gently, of a legal nature or anything else, come to that. Don't hesitate, Fiona. Silk's door is always open to a number of chambers, however junior. A member of chambers? Fiona repeated hopefully. I mean, some old squares are tremendously prejudiced against women. Of course, speaking for myself, he put a hand on one of Fiona's, which she had left lying about on the table. I have absolutely no objection to a pretty face around number 3 Equity Court. Haven't you, Claude? Mrs. Erskine Brown had fetched up beside the table and spoke with Esther. Oh, Philly, Erskine Brown hastily withdrew his hand. Are you going to join us for a goodie? You know, Fiona, of course. Yes, I know. Always. Philida looked suspiciously at the gold-topped bottle. What is it? Someone's birthday? No, I'm not joining you two. I'm going to go straight back to Chambers and write a letter. At which Philida Erskine Brown banged out of Pomeroy's, leaving her husband with a somewhat foolish expression on his face, and me with an entire bottle of claret. Philida, always as good as his word, did go back to her room in Chambers and started to write a lengthy, important letter to an official court. It was while she was doing this that there came a tap upon her door, which she ignored. Then the devout Ballard entered uninvited. This time, I have to rely on our Portia for a full account of what's transpired. And when she told me over a rather hilarious celebratory bottle about a month later, her recollection may have grown somewhat thin, but she swears that it was a Ballard transformed who came gliding up to her desk. He was wearing a somewhat garish spotted tie, in blue, as she remembered it. A matching silk handkerchief lolled from his top pocket, and surrounding the man was a fairly overpowering odor of some aftershave, which the manufacturer advertised as trouble starter. I saw your light on, Ballard murmured. Apparently, Philida didn't find this a statement of earth-shaking interest and went on writing. Mrs. Erskine Brown, Ballard tried again. You won't mind me calling you Phyllis? If you want to. Doesn't happen to be my name. Philida did not look up from her writing. Burning the midnight oil? Only 6:30. Although she had given little encouragement, Ballard came and perched, no doubt as he thought, jauntily on the corner of her desk and made what seemed to Philida to be an entirely unnecessary disclosure. I've never married, of course, he said. Lucky you, Philida said, with meaning as she went on with her work. I lead what I imagine you'd call a bit of bachelor life in Norwich. Decent-sized flat, though. All that sort of thing. Oh, good, Philida said in as neutral a manner as possible. But I don't want you to run away the idea that I don't like women, because I do like women. Very much indeed. I'm a perfectly normal sort of chap in that regard. Ballard assured her. Oh, jolly good. Philida was still buzzing. In fact, I have to confess this to you. I find the sight of a woman wigged and wearing a winged collar surprising. Well, let's be honest about this. Boring. There was a considerable pause, and then he blurted out. I saw the other day going up the stairs in the law courts, robed up. Did you? I was on my way to do a divorce. Philida was folding her letter with grim determination. Well, I just don't want you to be under any illusions. Ballard stood and gave Philida with which was no doubt meant to be a challenging look. I'm thoroughly in favor of women from every point of view. I'm sure the news will come as enormous relief to the women of the world. Licked the envelope and stuck it down. What she said seemed to have a strange effect on Ballard, and he became extremely nervous. Oh, I don't want it published in the paper, he said anxiously. I thought I'd made it perfectly clear to you in the course of private conversation. Well, you made it clear, Ballard. Philippa looked at him for the first time and didn't particularly like what she saw. Please, Sam, he corrected her skittishly. All right, Sam, you made it terribly clear, she repeated. Look, someday when you're not in court, he was smiling at her again. Why don't you let me take you out to a spot of lunch? To a very decent set meal at the Ludgate Hotel. Philida looked at him with amazement and contempt. She then got up and walked past him to the door, taking her letter. I've got to put this out to post, was all she had to say to that. I had gone back to our clerk's room to pick up some forgotten papers and was alone there. Henry and Diane having left for some unknown destination, when Phillida came in to put her letter in the post tray on Diane's desk. What on earth happened, Portia? I asked her. You left me to finish the bottle. Has everyone in this chamber's gone completely out of their heads? She replied with another question. Everyone? Ballard just made the most disgusting suggestion to me. It did seem extremely angry. Ballard did? Whatever was it? I asked, delighted. He invited me to have the set lunch at the Ludgate Hotel, and as for my so-called husband, words failing her, she went to the door. Good night, Rumpole. Night, Portia. It was then that I looked down at the letter she just written. The envelope was addressed to the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chancellor's office, the House of Lords, London. Good deal, I thought, was going on under the calm surface of life in our chambers at Equity Court. I was speculating on the precise nature of such movements with considerable pleasure as I started to walk to Temple Station. On my way, I found Miss Fiona Always waiting for a bus. I say, she hailed me, any more news about my getting into chambers? There is a tide in the affairs of women barristers, Fiona, I told her. Taken at the flood, God knows where. What's that mean exactly? It means that they'll either let you in or they'll throw me out. I moved on towards Hilda and home. Best of luck, both of us. His Honor Judge Leonard Dover was a fairly recent appointment to the collection of Old Bailey judges. He was a youngish man in his mid-40s, perhaps, certainly young enough to be my son, had fate chosen to inflict such a blow. He wore rimless glasses, and was a fairly rimless character. He was the sort of judge who has about as many laughs in him as a digital computer, and seemed to have been programmed by the civil service. Press all the right buttons, you know, the type, and he gives you 7 years in the nick. I have often thought that if he were plugged into the mains, Judge Dover could go on passing off sentences forever. On my way into Dover's court, I had passed Mrs. April Timpson, made up to the nines and wearing a sky blue trouser suit, come to celebrate her husband's day of fame. She accosted me anxiously. Tony says you're never to let the Timpsons down, Mr. Rumpole. Mrs. Timpson, I greeted her. Where's young Vincent today? Otherwise engaged. He's with my friend Chrissy. She's my neighbor and she's minding him. What are our chances, Mr. Rumpole? Talk to you later, I said, not caring to commit myself. After the jury had been sworn in, Judge Dover leaned toward me and said, in his usual unremarkable monotone, nothing that I'm going to say must now be taken against the defendant in any way. I stood in my seat. Whatever was going on, I didn't like the sound of it. This is a case in which it seems there is a particular danger of your being approached. Of course, you will be kept under police observation. He seemed to notice me at long last. What is it, Mr. Rumpole? Don't you want this jury to be protected from interference? I don't want the jury to be told this is a case concerning a serious crime before they've heard one word of evidence. I said with all possible vehemence. I don't want hints that my client belongs to a gang of serious professionals, when the truth may be that he's nothing but a snapper-upper of unconsidered trifles. I don't want the jury nobbled, but nobbled they have already been in my respectful submission by your lordship's warning. Mr. Rumpole, that's an extraordinary suggestion coming from you. It was made to answer an extraordinary statement coming from your lordship. What is your application, Mr. Rumpole? Judge Dover asked in a voice several degrees below zero. My lord, I ask that a fresh jury may be impaneled who will have heard no prejudicial suggestions against my client. Your application is refused. I had pressed the wrong button and got the automatic printout. There was Nothing for it but to sit down looking extremely hard done by. Members of the jury, the jurors turned back to them. I have already made it perfectly clear to you that nothing I have said contains any suggestion whatever against Mr. Timpson. Does that satisfy you, Mr. Rumpole? About as much as a glass of cold carriage, you told darling. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you, Mr. Rumpole. I said, I suppose it will have to, my lord. I rose in a perfunctory manner. Yes, Mr. Rumpole, the jury said. Suppose it will. Back in the alleged mansion flat, things weren't going too well either. Hilda, in the course of tidying up, found my old Oxford Book of English verse on a chair. I had been seeking solace in the intimations of immortality the night before, and she put it on my excellent shelf. No doubt she thumped it down a fair bit, for my elegant carpentry creaked and then collapsed, casting a good many books and a certain amount of wine to the ground. I have spoken already of the strength of my wife's character. Apparently, she went out, purchased a number of raw plugs and an electric drill, and started a career as a handyman, full effects of which weren't noticed by me for some time. In court, the prosecution was in the hands of Mr. Hilary Onslow, a languid-looking young man whose fair curly hair came sprouting out from under his wig. In spite of his air of well-born indifference, he could be at times a formidable opponent. One of the earliest witnesses was the supergrass, Jerry Molloy, an overweight character with a red face, glossy back hair, who sweated a good deal and seemed about to burst out of his buttons. Mr. Molloy, I want to come now to the facts of the Pond Hill Bank raid. Pond Hill Bank jug, yes, sir. Jerry sounded only too eager to help. How many of you were engaged on that particular enterprise? There were two with saw-offs, one collector. And you with the sledgehammer? Onslow asked. I was the sledgeman, yes. There were 5 of us together. 5 of you counting the driver? Yes, sir. Did you see the driver? Of course I did. Witness sounded very sure of himself. The driver picked me up at the knee. Had you seen him before? Seen him before? Molloy thought carefully and then answered, no, sir. Some weeks later, did you attend an identification parade? Onslow turned to me and asked languidly, is there any dispute as to whom he picked out at the ID? No dispute as to that. No, I granted it. Thank you, Mr. Rumpole. The judge gave me a faint look of approval. I did to be of assistance, my lord, I rose to say, and sank back into my seat as quickly as possible. Did you pick out the defendant, Mr. Timpson? Onslow asked. Tony Timpson was staring at the windows from the dock. Jerry Molloy looked away to avoid his accusing eyes and met a glare from April Timpson in the public gallery. Yes, the answer was a little muted. I pointed to him. No hesitation. Thank you, Mr. Molloy. Hilary Onslow sat and crossed his long legs elegantly. I rose full of righteous indignation and looked at the jury in a pained manner as I cast my questions in the general direction of the witness box. Mr. Molloy, you have turned Queen's evidence in this case. Come again? The answer was impertinent, so I put my voice up several decibels. Translated into everyday language, Mr. Molloy, you are a grass, not even a super grass, a common or garden ordinary bit of a grass. There was a welcome stir of laughter from the jury, immediately silenced by the computer on the bench. Members of the jury, Judge Dover reminded them, if they needed reminding. This is not a place of public entertainment. This witness is giving evidence for the prosecution, he added, so that covered the matter. You're giving evidence for the prosecution because you were caught. I turned to the witness box then. Not being a particularly efficient sledge, you tripped over your holdall in the street and missed the getaway car. You were apprehended, Mr. Molloy, in the gutter. They nicked me. Yes, Molloy admitted. You have already been sentenced to 2 years for your part in the robbery? I got it too, yes. Considerable reduction because you agreed with the police to grass on your colleagues, I said. I got under the odds. Yes, he agreed less readily. Considerably under the odds, Mr. Malloy, and for that, you were prepared to betray your own family? Come again? 3 of your colleagues were members of the clan Malloy. The Malloys, yes. And only one Timpson? Yes. And as the Montagues to the Capulets, I put it to you, so are the Timpsons to the Malloys. Did you say the Montagues, Mr. Rumpole? The judge seemed puzzled by a name he hadn't heard in the case before, so my literary impreference was lost on the computer. I simply meant that the Malloys hate and despise the Timpsons. Isn't that so, Mr. Jerry Malloy? I asked the witness. Never gone on, no. It's traditional. Although what? I believe my cousin Sean's wife, when he separated from lives close, lived quite close to Tony Timpson and his wife, and said, I interrupted a speech which I thought might somewhat blur the picture I had just painted. Apart from that, it's true, isn't it, that the Malloys are a different league from the Timpsons? What league is that, Mr. Rumpole? Judge Dover looked puzzled. The big league, my lord, I helped him understand. You and your relations, according to your evidence, did the Barclays Bank impinge the Midland, Croydon, and National West in Barking. I was back with the witness. That's what I've said. He was sweating more now. 2 of his lower shirt buttons had gone off about their own affair. Spreading your favors evenly around the money market. Have you ever known a Timpson to be president of a bank robber before, Mr. Malloy? Not as I can remember. But my brother Charlie was off sick and we were short of a driver. You were. Unhappily, or all your Malloy colleagues seem to have vanished. At which point, my learned friend, Mr. Hilary Onslow, felt it right to unwind his leg and draw himself to his great height. My lord, he said, I explained to the jury that determined efforts to trace the other pretenders of the robbery are still being made by the police. My learned friend wishes to give evidence. Perhaps your lordship would like him to go to the witness. Steady on, Rumpole, don't tease him. Phillida whispered a bit of sound advice, so I said with deep humility, so it was, my lord, I entirely agree. I turned back with no humility at all to Jerry Malloy. With your relations all gone to ground, you had to have a victim, didn't you? Justify your privileged treatment as a grass. The jury, who looked extremely interested, clearly saw the point. The witness pretended that he didn't. Victim? He was playing for time. Gave him none. So you decided to pick me out of the despised Timpsons and put him in the frame. Put him in the what, Mr. Rumpole? The judge affected not to understand. I hadn't time to teach him plain English. Put him in the driver's seat, where he certainly never was, I suggested to the super crash. He was there, I told you. Jerry Malloy was getting indignant. Where did you meet? One of the Malloy's houses, he said after a pause. Which one? I think it was Michael's. Rick's, I can't be sure. Can't you? It was Sean, he decided. And having to frame Tony, I went on quickly, was it some member of the Malloy family who planted a packet of stolen banknotes in the Timpson home? It couldn't have been him, could it, Mr. Rumpole? The judge was looking back at his notes. This witness has been in custody ever since the robbery. Yes, my lord, I then asked Malloy, did you receive visits in prison before you made your statement? A few visits, yes. From your wife? 1 or 2. And it was through her that the word was sent out to claim the money on Tony Timpson? I made the suggestion for the benefit of the jury, but it deeply shocked Gerald Supergrass Malloy. I wouldn't ask my wife to do them shorter messages, he said. Deeply pained. Back at home, Hilda, swathed in an overall, was drilling the wall to receive a new consignment of easy-do shelving in a completely professional manner. I was also plugging away in court. asking a few pertinent questions of Detective Inspector Broom, the officer in charge of the case. Jerry Malloy made a statement 2 days after the robbery at about 2:30 in the afternoon, I suggested. 2:35 to be precise, I said. Right. Oh, please. I'm sure my lord would like you to be very precise. You went straight round to Tony Timpson's house. We did not. In a police car with the siren blaring, I think we had the siren on for some of the time. We were in a hurry. You were lucky enough to find him at home? Well, he wasn't out doing window cleaning, sir. There was a small titter from the jury. I interrupted as soon as possible. My client opened the door to you at once? As soon as we knocked. Yep. No sort of interval. He tried to move the money to a more sensible hiding place, for instance. Perhaps he was happy where it was. Before he got another laugh, I came in quickly with, or perhaps, Inspector, he had no idea that the money would be put out there. I don't know about that. Don't you? One last matter. Was it Jerry Malloy who told you that Tony Timpson was a dangerous member of a big-time robbery firm who might try and nobble the jewelry and the jury? Malloy told us that, yes. Inspector Broom was a little reluctant. So a solemn warning was given by the learned judge on the word of a self-confessed sledgehammer man who has already been convicted of malicious wounding, robbery, and grievous bodily harm. Yes. Short answer came even more reluctantly from the inspector. Doesn't that solemn warning give quite an unfair impression of Tony Timpson? Unfair, sir? Broom did his best to look puzzled. You'd never put Tony Timpson in for this serious crime award, would you? He's a small-time thief who specializes in relieving householders of their home entertainment, video machines, and the like. That would seem to be so. Yes, the inspector admitted. So if I said to you that this robbery was quite out of Tony Timpson's league, how could you translate that suggestion? I would say it's out of his character, sir, judging by past form. So I sat down with some heartfelt thanks to Detective Inspector Broom. At the end of the day, I went with Phillida and Bernard to visit our client in the cell. He appeared pleased with her progress, but I haven't yet to answer what seemed to be the single important question in the case. The money in the washing machine, Tony, I asked. Must have been put there by someone. Does April go out much? She takes young Vince round to friends. Friend Chrissy? The question seemed important to me, but Tony answered vaguely. I think that's her name. I don't know the woman. Money found in the kitchen, I said thoughtfully. I don't suppose you do much cooking, do you, Tony? Oh, leave it out, Mr. Rumpole. Tony found the suggestion highly diverting. Never wash up? Of course I don't. He could hardly suppress his laughter. That's April's job, isn't it? I suppose it's only barristers who spend the evenings up to their wrists in the fairy liquid. Yes. And of course you don't run young Vince's Smalls through the washing machine. Now, would I be expected to do a job like that? He looked to Mrs. Erskine Brown for support. Would I? You mean it would be a bit like having a woman defend you? Phillida asked in a pointed sort of way. Tony Timpson had the grace to look apologetic. I never meant nothing personal, he said. It just doesn't seem natural. Really? Phillida was unimpressed. As a matter of fact, my husband is quite a good performer on the spin dryer. Poor bloke. Tony was laughing again. I interrupted. Let's take it that you leave such matters to April. When does she do the washing, Tony? On a Monday? So, he didn't sound particularly interested. The bank raid was on a Monday. Jerry Malloy made a statement on Wednesday afternoon, and the police were round at once. Whoever put it there didn't have much time. I don't know, and he added hopelessly, I just never go near the bleeding washing machine. I gathered up my brief and returned to the free world. See you tomorrow, Tony, I said. Come on, Portia, I think we've got what we wanted. When I left the old building that evening and stepped off the pavement, a small white sports car, driven with great speed and expertise, flashed past me, almost cutting me off somewhere past my prime. Passing 2 or 3 slowly moving taxis on the inside, dipped off and was lost in the traffic. I caught sight of a blonde head behind the wheel. deduced that the driver was none other than that devoted housewife, April Tim. I didn't sleep much that night. I was pretty busy putting two and two together to make about 5,000 nickers. Around dawn, I drifted off and dreamt of washing machines and spin dryers. And Ballard was bringing me a bouquet of roses and inviting me to lunch. And Fiona always had decided to leave the bar and take up life as a coal miner, saying the pay was so much better. So I arrived at the Old Bailey in a somewhat jaded condition. Having robed for the day's work, I went up to the canteen on the third floor and bought myself a black coffee and a slightly flaccid sausage roll. I wasn't enjoying it much when Erskine Brown came up to me in a state of considerable distress, holding out a copy of the Times in a trembling hand. Poor fellow looked decidedly evil. "The sick list, Rumpole?" he stammered. "Have you seen the new QCs?" Having got beyond the crossword, I opened the page and found the relevant page. "Well, here's your name. What are you worrying about?" "My name?" Erskine Brown asked bitterly. "Erskine Brown, Mrs.?" I read the entry more carefully. Oh, I do see. I felt for the man. My heart bled for him. "She never warned me, Rumpole." I had no idea she'd applied. Had you? No, I honestly hadn't. Haven't you asked her about it? She left home before the paper came, and now she's gone to ground in the ladies' robing room. Then he asked with a faint hope, "You think it might be some sort of misprint?" I might have sat there for some time commemorating with Claude, but I saw a blonde head in a blue trouser suit by the tier. I rose, excused myself to be still suffering, still a junior barrister, and arrived alongside Mrs. April Tim, just in time to pay for her coffee. "You're very kind, Mr. Rumpole," she said. "Sometimes," I agreed. She moved to a table. I went with her. "Young Vincent well this morning, is he? Chrissy Malloy looking after him properly?" "Chrissy's all right," she said, and then looked up at me and spoke very quietly. "Tony doesn't know she's a Malloy." I sat down beside her and took my time in lighting a small cigar. "No, Mrs. Timpson, Tony doesn't know very much, does he? We were at school together, me and Chrissy. Anyway, she and Sean's Malloys separated, but still friends," I suggested. "Close enough for the Malloy firm to meet at Chrissy's house." I blew out smoke and then asked, "When did you know they were short of a driver?" "I may have heard someone mention it." She looked away from me and stirred her coffee. So I told her the whole story as though she didn't know. "Your husband wouldn't have been the slightest use in a getaway car, would he? He'd have had 3 parking tickets and he'll hit a milk float before they got clear of the bank. You, on the other hand, I happen to have noticed, are distinctly nippy driving through traffic." A silence fell between us. It lasted until I said, "What was the matter? Tony not ambitious enough for you? Why ever should you think?" She looked up at me then. Whatever was meant to be, the look was not innocent. "Because of where you put the money," I told her quietly. "It was the one place in the house you knew your husband would never look." She had the nerve of an accomplished villain, at Mrs. April Timpson. She took a long swig of coffee, and then she asked me what I was going to do. "The real question is, what are you going to do?" And then I gave her my legal advice. "Leave it out, April," I said. "Give it up, Mrs. Timpson. Keep away from it. It's men's work. You know, let the men make a mess of it." I paused to let the advice sink in, and then I stood to go. It was the first time, I imagine. Better make it than the last. I got into court sometime before the learned computer took his seat on the bench. As soon as Phillida arrived, I gave her, leaving it right to take my junior into my full confidence, my solution to the case, and an account of my conversation with April Timpson. She thought for a moment and then asked, "But why didn't Jerry Malloy identify her?" "He was ashamed, don't you understand? He didn't want to admit that the great Malloys went out with a woman driver." "What on earth are we going to do?" We can't prove it was April. Let's hope they can't prove it was Tony. The jury don't much care for the mini grass, and the Malloys might have planted the money. Hilary Onslow came in then, gave us a cheerful good morning, and took his place. Spoke to Philip in a whisper. Only one thing we can do, Portia. Just give them the speech about leaving down. No, I will, she said firmly. What? I wasn't following her drift. I'm your leader now. Don't you read the Times, Rumpel? I have taken silk. At which point the usher shouted, be upstanding. Judge Dover was upon us. He looked at the defense team and said, yes, Mr. Rumpel, and saw that Philida was on her feet. This is Erskine Brown. I believe that certain congratulations are in order. Yes, my lord, I believe they are, said our Portia, announced that she would now call the defendant. Tony gave evidence, as he denied knowing anything about the money or the whereabouts of the Pond Hill Bank, or even the exact situation of his own washing machine. He was a difficult witness to cross-examine. Onslow did his best and made a moderately effective final speech. And then I sat quietly and listened to Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown, now my learned leader. I smiled as I heard her reach a familiar peroration. Members of the jury, she was addressing them with carefully controlled emotion. Soon this case will be over. In a little while, you will go back to your jobs and your families, and you will forget about it. At most, it is only a small part of your lives. But for my client, Tony Timpson, it is the whole of his life. And it is that life I leave with confidence in your hand, certain that there can be only one verdict in this case, not guilty. Then Phillida sank down in her seat exhausted, just as I had taught her to, as I had taught you always and anyone else who would care to listen. Good speech, I congratulated Phillida as he came out of court when the Timpson case was over. Yes, it always was. Portia of Belmont, Phillida Erskine Brown, Nee Trout, and Fiona of Always. The great tradition of female advocates carried on with a small cigar. Phillida looked at me. It's not enough for you that we won Timpson, is it? Not enough that you got the jury to disbelieve Jerry Malloy and think the money may have been planted. You want to win the Always case as well. Well, I said reasonably, why shouldn't we take on Fiona? Over my dead body. She moved toward the lifts. I followed her. Oh, why? She was making a play for Claude. Found them all over each other in Pomeroy. That's when I got so angry. I applied for silk. Without telling your husband? I asked carefully. Afraid so. I better come clean about this. I took off my wig and stood looking at her. She looked back at me, deeply suspicious. What have you been up to, Rumpole? Well, I just wanted your Claude to look on Miss Always with a warm and friendly eye. I mean, I thought that it would increase her chances of getting into. You wanted Claude to warm to her? Phillida's voice was rising to a note of outrage. I thought it might help. Yes, I admitted. Rumpole, I suppose you told him that she fancied him. Now, Portia, would I do such a thing? I protested. Very probably. If you wanted to win badly enough, I imagine you told him she thought you looked like Robert Redford. No, I protest. I was hurt. This is utterly, entirely unreal. I told him she thought he looked like a fella called Newman. And had Always actually said that? Phillida was still uncertain of the fact. Well, if you want me to be entirely honest, it would make a change, necessarily. Well, no, she hadn't. And then, quite unexpectedly, our Portia smiled. Poor old Claude, she said. You know what you were doing, Rumpole? You can't rely on a girl to get in on her own talents, can you? You have to manipulate and rely on everyone else's vanity. You were simply exploiting the male sex. Now you know, I asked her, will you vote for Fiona? Tell me one good reason. Ballard's against her. I suppose that's one good reason, and because of you, I've ended up a silk. What on earth can I tell Claude? seemed for a delightful moment overcome with guilt, blushed very prettily as though she had to admit the existence of a lover. Tell him, I suggested. The Lord Chancellor just thought there weren't enough women's silks. That's why you got it. He'll feel better if he thinks there's no damn merit about this thing. I suppose so. She looked a little disappointed as she asked me, is that true? Quite possibly. After all, I hadn't undertaken to tell her the whole truth about anything. When I got home that night, Hilda asked me if I had noticed anything. Suspecting that she had a new hairdo or bought a new dress, I said that of course she was looking extremely pretty. Not me. Look at the walls. The shelf I had put up was not firmly screwed and looking even better than usual. It seemed to have popped up, and there were shelves all over the place, vainly supporting potted plants and plants. What did you do, Hilda? Did you get a man in? Yes, me. It all ended once again with a Chambers party. The excuse for that particular shindig was a swearing in at the House of Lords of Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown at one of Her Majesty's councils. She made a resplendent figure as she came to split a few bottles of champagne with us at Ballard's room. Her handsome female face peeped out between the long spaniel's ears of her full-bottomed wig. She wore a long silk gown with black purse on her back. There were lace cuffs on her tailcoat and lace at her throat. Her black skirt ended with black stockings and diamond buckle shoes. She carried her white gloves in one hand and the glass of Mercier in the other. Just when matters were going with a certain amount of swing, Ballard took it upon himself to make a speech. In our great profession, he was saying, and I muttered in, amen, we are sometimes accused of prejudice against the female sex. Shame, said Erskine. That may be true of some sets of chambers, but it cannot be said of us at 3 Equity Court, Ballard continued. As in many other things, we take the lead and set the example. Today, we celebrate the well-served promotion of Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown to the front row. Lily looks very fine in a silk gown, doesn't she, Rumble? The proud husband said to me. Gorgeous, I agree. And we welcome a new member of our set, young Fiona always, Ballard concluded. All around me, barristers were toasting the triumph of women. You know, between ourselves, Philly got it because it's the Lord Chancellor's policy to appoint more women. Erskine Brown told me confidentially. How appalling, I looked on the man with considerable sympathy. You're a victim of sexual discrimination. He's made me a promise. Next year she's going to take some time off. Good, I might get my work back. We're going to have, his voice confidentially, a little companion for Tristan. Isolde, I suggested. Oh, really, Rumpole? I moved away from him as I saw Phillida in all her glory go up to Fiona, who was wearing wide trousers, which coming in just below the knees, had the appearance of a whitish split skirt. Well done, always, Phillida gave the girl an encouraging smile. Welcome to Chambers. Thank you, Mrs. Erskine Brown. Fiona seemed genuinely pleased. But Phillida had stopped smiling. Oh, just one thing always. No culottes. Oh, said Fiona. Really? If you want to get on at the bar, and it's a pretty tough profession, Phillida told her, just go in for those sort of baggy trouser arrangements. Just not on. No, remember that, Fiona, I put my oar in. Fellow looks so much better in a skirt. And that is again